For the entire world, she was just another old woman of 85 years, sitting in a creaking wooden chair by the window of her house on Sycamore Ridge Road, watching the same oak tree she had watched for 41 years slowly lose its leaves to another October. Her own children sat in her living room and spoke about her future the way people talk about weather, like she had no say in it, no feeling about it, like she was a condition to be managed rather than a woman with a whole life still pulsing inside her chest. Miriam June Calloway listened to them plan her days, her meals, her room at Pinehaven Senior Living, and she felt something she had not expected to feel at 85. Not grief, not surrender. Anger, quiet and cold and absolute, the kind that doesn't shake your hands or make your voice crack, the kind that simply decides. What they didn't know, what nobody in that room could have guessed, was that Miriam had already been making plans of her own. And what she did on the morning they came to take her away would stop every one of them cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of an 85-year-old woman who walked into the forest behind her property with nothing but a bag, a set of old tools, and a grief she had been carrying alone for 2 years. A woman who refused to disappear into a facility she never agreed to. A woman who built something with her own hands in the trees that her children said she was too frail to even walk through. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Miriam June Calloway had turned 85 in September, 2 weeks after the first hard frost of the year, and she had spent that birthday the way she spent most days since her husband Walter died, working. She had repaired a section of fence along the east side of her property that the frost had buckled. She had put up the last of her tomato preserves. She had eaten supper alone at the kitchen table she and Walter had bought in 1987 from a craftsman in Elkins who made it by hand from a single walnut tree, and she had read until 10 o'clock and gone to bed without making a fuss about the date. Her children called, of course. Bruce from his office in Richmond, Diane from her kitchen in Roanoke, Kevin from the parking lot of a grocery store in Charlottesville, all of them cheerful and a little rushed. Miriam thanked them and told them she was fine, which was true in most of the ways that mattered and not quite true in the way none of them ever asked about. She was fine physically or close enough. Her knees ached on cold mornings, and her right hand had developed a tremor that appeared when she was tired, a slight unsteady flutter that annoyed her more than it frightened her. Her hearing had thinned over the past few years, high frequencies going soft and distant, though she heard everything people said to her well enough, including things they probably assumed she missed. Her mind was sharp. She read 2 newspapers a day, kept a journal she had been writing in since 1974, grew her own vegetables in a garden that ran 40 feet along the south side of the house, and could tell you, without looking it up, the name of every bird that visited her feeder by species, call, and seasonal pattern. What she was not fine about was the silence. Not the silence of the house itself, which she had made her peace with in the months after Walter died, but the particular silence that had grown between her and the land behind the house. 11 acres of mixed hardwood forest that she and Walter had owned since 1981, that they had walked together every season for over 4 decades, that still held the trails they had worn into it with their own boots, the clearing they had found together in the middle of it where the canopy opened up, and on clear nights you could see more stars than you believed possible that close to town. She had not gone into the forest since the week before Walter's funeral. She had meant to go back. She had walked to the tree line a dozen times in the 2 years since he died, stood at the edge of it with one hand on the bark of the first big maple, and then turned around and gone back to the house. She wasn't ready, or she had told herself she wasn't ready, which is a different thing entirely from actually not being ready. Miriam had met Walter Calloway at a hardware store in Elkins, West Virginia, in the spring of 1966. She had been 28 years old, teaching 3rd grade at the elementary school on Grant Street, and renovating the small house she had bought on her own with 3 years of saved salary. Walter had been 31, recently returned from 2 years working on construction projects in Baltimore, looking to start something of his own back in the part of the state where he'd grown up. He was buying lumber. She was buying paint. They had an argument, friendly but pointed, about the correct way to prep old plaster walls, And by the end of it, Walter had offered to help her with the project on weekends, and she had said yes without overthinking it. They were married 14 months later in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard. Her mother cried. Walter's father shook his hand for a long time without saying anything, which was how that man expressed everything that mattered to him. Miriam wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she chose at a shop in Morgantown, ivory cotton with a small eyelet pattern along the collar. And Walter told her years later, many times, that the moment he saw her in it standing in that backyard, he had understood for the first time in his life what the word home actually meant. They built their life steadily, without extravagance. Walter started a small contracting business that grew slowly and honestly over the years into something that employed 6 men and had more work than it could take. Miriam taught for 17 years before leaving to raise Bruce and Diane and Kevin, and then spent the next 2 decades doing what she described to anyone who asked as everything else, which covered an enormous amount of ground. Managing the household finances, keeping the garden that fed them through every summer, volunteering at the school library, serving for 9 years on the town's planning board, learning to do her own electrical work because Walter was too busy and she refused to pay someone else to do something she could learn herself. When Walter died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning in November, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee half drunk in front of him, Miriam lost the person who had been her counterweight for 56 years. She did not collapse. She handled the funeral, the paperwork, the calls to the children, the thank you notes, the estate, all of it with the competence that had characterized her entire life. But something shifted in her after that, something she couldn't name precisely, a feeling that the world had quietly rearranged itself overnight into a place she hadn't agreed to live in. She was managing. She was doing what needed doing, what she had not figured out yet. As her 85th birthday came and went, and the oak tree outside her window lost the last of its October leaves, was what she was actually living for. That question, which she had been circling for 2 years without quite looking at it directly, was about to be answered in a way she never expected. And it would start, of all things, with her children sitting in her living room, telling her that her time for choosing was over. Walter Calloway had always said that the best thing he ever built was not a house. He had built plenty of those over the years, custom homes and additions and renovations across 3 counties in West Virginia, structures that still stood decades later because Walter did not cut corners and did not let his crew cut them either. But when people asked him what he was proudest of, he would pause in that particular way. He had a slow breath in, eyes going somewhere distant for a moment, and then he would say, "The life Miriam and I made together. That's the best thing I ever put my hands to." Miriam had heard him say it so many times that she'd stopped being moved by it the way she was the first time. That was just how marriage worked, she supposed. The things that once stopped your breath became the furniture of your days, present and solid and easy to walk past without seeing. She understood now, sitting alone in the house on Sycamore Ridge Road, that she had not appreciated it enough while he was saying it. That was the particular cruelty of grief. It taught you the value of things at the exact moment they were gone. They had bought the 11 acres behind the house in 1981, 3 years after they moved to Sycamore Ridge Road. The land had belonged to an older couple who were moving to be near their daughter in Ohio and wanted a quick sale. Walter had looked at it one afternoon in March, walked the tree line, pushed through into the first 100 yards of forest, come back out with mud on his boots, and said simply, "We should have this." Miriam had trusted his instincts about land the way she trusted his instincts about most things, and they had signed the papers 2 weeks later. The forest was mixed hardwood, mostly oak and maple with a scattering of birch along the lower ground where a small creek ran through the middle of the property. Walter had spent the first 2 summers cutting a network of trails through it, not wide trails, just narrow paths wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and he'd done it by hand with loppers and a pruning saw and a machete he'd bought at a farm supply store in Elkins. Miriam had helped on weekends, and the children had helped in the way children help with things, enthusiastically for about 40 minutes, and then not at all. By the 3rd summer, they had a proper system of paths that circled the whole property and connected at the center, where the clearing was. The clearing had not been their doing. It was a natural gap in the canopy, roughly 40 feet across, where a cluster of old trees had fallen in some storm years before they owned the land, and nothing had grown back to fill the space above it yet. The ground there was soft with decades of leaf litter. In spring, it was covered in wildflowers. In summer, the grass grew knee-high. In winter, when the hardwoods were bare and the sky was low and gray, it felt like standing in the middle of something ancient and indifferent and strangely comforting. They went to the clearing the way other people went to church. Not every week, but regularly, and always with a sense that it was a different kind of time from ordinary time. They would pack a thermos of coffee and walk out there in the early morning before the day had demands in it, and they would sit on the old log Walter had dragged to the edge of the clearing years ago and just be there together, not always talking, not always doing anything, just present in that place. Bruce and Diane and Kevin had grown up knowing the forest was there, but had never quite shared their parents' feeling about it. To the children, it was a place to explore when they were young, to ignore when they were teenagers, and to barely register as adults with their own lives in other cities. They did not understand what the clearing meant. Miriam had never tried very hard to explain it. Some things either land in a person or they don't, and the forest was one of those things. Walter had kept the trails clear right up until the last 2 years of his life, when his health had started its slow withdrawal from the things he loved doing. Even then, he'd gone out as often as he could manage, slower each time, stopping more frequently, but going. The last time he walked the full loop was the August before he died, 3 months before the stroke. He had come back and looking tired in a way Miriam had learned to read as different from ordinary tiredness, sat down at the kitchen table, and said, without apparent sadness, but with a kind of finality that made her chest tighten, "I want you to promise me you'll keep going in there after I'm gone. Don't let it go back to nothing." She had promised. She had not kept that promise, and the guilt of that sat in her quietly every time she looked out the back window at the tree line. What Walter had never told her, what she would not discover until the worst moment of her 85th year forced her back into those trees, was that he had left something out there for her. Not a letter this time, not documents in a safety deposit box. Something else entirely. Something he had built with his own hands in the last summer of his life, out in the clearing where no one would find it, waiting for the day Miriam was ready to go back. The visits started changing in January. Miriam noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly and without comment, filing the observation away and watching to see if the pattern held. Bruce had always called on Sunday evenings, a reliable 15-minute check-in that covered weather, her health, his work, and not much else. In January, he started calling on Thursdays, too. Diane, who visited in person twice a year at most, showed up unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon in February with a casserole and a look on her face that Miriam recognized from the years when Diane was a teenager trying to hide something. Kevin, the youngest, started texting every morning. Just a single line. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" Every single morning, like a form she was expected to fill out and return. She answered all of it patiently. She told Bruce she was fine. She ate Diane's casserole and thanked her for it. She texted Kevin back each morning with something specific, not just fine, but an actual detail, what she had made for breakfast, whether the frost had come again, what bird had shown up at the feeder that morning, because she wanted him to understand that her days had texture and content and were not simply a waiting room she was sitting in until something went wrong. It didn't seem to help. The calls kept coming, the visits kept arriving unannounced, and the questions underneath the questions kept getting louder, even when nobody was actually asking them out loud. Miriam could hear them anyway. She had raised these 3 people. She knew how they thought. The family meeting happened on a Saturday in late March, which was still cold enough in the Appalachians that Miriam had the wood stove going when all 3 of them arrived together, which was itself the first sign that something had been coordinated. They did not arrive together by accident. Bruce and Diane had driven up from their respective cities. Kevin had come from Charlottesville. They had planned this, scheduled it, probably discussed it on a group phone call that Miriam was not part of, and now they were sitting in her living room with the careful, slightly too gentle expressions of people who had rehearsed what they were going to say. Bruce started because Bruce always started. He was 61, the oldest, a contract lawyer who had inherited Walter's deliberate manner of speaking without inheriting Walter's instinct for when to stop talking. He folded his hands in his lap and told Miriam that they were worried about her. That living alone on Sycamore Ridge Road at 85 was a situation that carried real risks. That they loved her and did not want something terrible to happen before they had taken reasonable steps to prevent it. Miriam sat in her chair by the window and let him finish. Diane went next. She had printed things, actual printed pages, which she pulled from a folder she had brought in her bag. Information about Pinehaven Senior Living in Elkins. Floor plans of the available apartments. A list of amenities. A printed schedule of weekly activities. She laid these on the coffee table between them like evidence, smoothing each page flat with the palm of her hand, and explained that Pinehaven was well regarded, that it was only 20 minutes away, that Miriam would have her own space and her independence within the facility, that the staff-to-resident ratio was excellent. Kevin said less. He sat at the end of the sofa with his hands between his knees and told her, in a voice that was genuinely pained rather than rehearsed, that he was scared every single morning when he texted her and waited for her response. That the 10 or 15 minutes before she texted back were the worst part of his day. That he knew it wasn't fair to make his fear her problem, but he couldn't help it. Miriam looked at Kevin for a long moment after he said that. Of the three, he had always been the most honest about what he actually felt, and she loved him for it even now when the feeling he was expressing was being used as an argument against her. "I hear you," she said. "All three of you. I understand that you're worried, and I know it comes from love. I also need you to hear me when I tell you that I am managing my life well. I'm not confused. I am not in immediate danger. I do not want to move to Pinehaven." Bruce's expression did not change. "Mom, this isn't really about what any of us want. It's about what's responsible. I've been responsible for my own life for 85 years, Miriam said, keeping her voice level. "I haven't stopped. Living alone out here at your age," Diane said carefully, "with no immediate neighbors, no one who would know if you fell or had a medical episode. I have a medical alert device. I have a phone. I have neighbors 3/4 of a mile down the road who check on me regularly." "It's not enough," Bruce said. "We've looked at this carefully, Mom. We've done the research, we've talked to people who know about elder care, and the consensus is clear." Miriam felt something go very still inside her at the word consensus. They had consulted people. They had built a case. This was not a conversation. She understood now with complete certainty. It was a notification. The confirmation came 30 seconds later, when Diane reached back into her folder and pulled out one more page. A signed contract. A deposit receipt. Her name, printed in a box at the top. Miriam J. Calloway, incoming resident, Pinehaven Senior Living, date of move-in, April 19th. They had already signed. They had already paid. They had given her 23 days. After her children left that Saturday evening, satisfied in the particular way people are satisfied when they believe they have handled something difficult responsibly, Miriam sat in her chair by the window for a long time, without turning on any lights. The room went dark around her gradually, the last of the March daylight pulling back from the walls, and she sat in the growing dark and did not move. She was not crying. She had cried the night Walter died, and the night after, and several nights in the weeks that followed, and she had no particular shame about that. But this was different. What she felt sitting in the dark with that deposit receipt printed in Diane's neat hand, sitting on her coffee table, was not grief. It was something colder and more clarifying. The feeling of a door being closed on you from the outside and locked by someone who kept the key and called it love. 23 days. They had given her 23 days, as though that were generous. As though the appropriate response to being told your life was being relocated without your consent was gratitude for the advance notice. Miriam got up, turned on the lamp by the chair, picked up the Pinehaven brochure Diane had left, and read through it carefully from front to back. She was thorough about things. She always had been. The facility looked clean in the photographs. The rooms were adequate. The activity schedule was full of things she had no interest in whatsoever. There was a photograph of a group of elderly residents sitting around a table doing a jigsaw puzzle, all of them smiling in the slightly effortful way people smile when someone is pointing a camera at them. And Miriam looked at that photograph for a long time before setting the brochure face down on the table and go to the kitchen to make tea. She stood at the kitchen window while the kettle heated and looked out at the back of the property. The tree line was invisible in the dark, just a black wall at the edge of the yard where the porch light gave out, but she knew exactly where it was. She had been looking at it for 41 years. She thought about Walter's request, the promise she had made and not kept. Don't let it go back to nothing. She had been telling herself for 2 years that she wasn't ready to go back into the forest. Standing at the kitchen window in the dark 3 weeks before her children planned to move her out of her own house, she admitted to herself for the first time that this was not entirely true. She had been afraid, yes, but she had also been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for a reason that was strong enough to send her back in. She had one now. The planning took Miriam the better part of 2 weeks, and she did it the way she did everything carefully, without rushing, thinking several steps ahead. Her children visited during those 2 weeks, bringing more information about Pinehaven, asking what she wanted to keep in her new apartment, measuring things with a tape measure that Bruce produced from his coat pocket with the efficiency of a man who had already mentally moved on to the logistics. Miriam smiled and offered them coffee and let them measure whatever they wanted and said very little and thought about everything. She had resources they knew nothing about. The first was physical. Walter had kept a full woodworking and carpentry shop in the outbuilding behind the house, a low timber frame structure he had built himself in 1989 that held 40 years of accumulated tools, most of them hand tools, because Walter had always preferred the feel of handwork to power tools for anything requiring precision. Miriam knew every tool in that shop. She had watched Walter use them for decades, had helped him on enough projects over the years to understand the basics of most of them, and had a practical competence with her hands that her children had apparently never noticed or had long since forgotten. The second resource was the land itself. 11 acres of forest that was legally hers, paid off and clear, with the trails Walter had cut still visible if overgrown, and the clearing at the center still waiting, open to the sky. The third was a conversation she had not thought about in 2 years, a conversation Walter had with her 6 months before he died, sitting on the back porch in the early evening with the tree line going gold in the late summer light. He had been talking about the clearing, about how much time he'd spent out there that summer, and then he had said something that had struck her as slightly odd at the time, but that she had filed away without examining. "I've been working on something out there," he'd said, in the careful tone he used when he didn't want to be pressed for details. "Something for you. You'll find it when you're ready to go back." She had assumed he meant he had cleared more of the trails, had perhaps set another log at the edge of the clearing to sit on. She had not asked, because Walter was entitled to his surprises, and she had learned over 56 years not to pull at the threads he left loose on purpose. Now she turned that sentence over in her mind every night before she fell asleep. "Something for you. You'll find it when you're ready to go back." On the 14th day after the family meeting, 12 days before Bruce and Diane and Kevin were scheduled to arrive with a moving van and boxes, Miriam June Calloway went into Walter's workshop, took inventory of everything in it, and began making a list of what she would need. She was going back into the forest, and she was not coming out until she had built something worth staying for. Miriam left on a Tuesday morning at 4:30 a.m., 9 days before her children were scheduled to arrive with their boxes and their moving van and their carefully managed guilt about the whole thing. She had chosen Tuesday deliberately. Bruce always called on Sunday evenings and Thursday mornings. Diane had visited the previous Friday and would not come back until the move date. Kevin texted every morning, but he was in Charlottesville, 3 hours away, and a text could go unanswered for hours before anyone decided it was an emergency rather than a dead phone battery. She had 9 days, maybe 10 if she was lucky, before they came looking in earnest. The night before she left, she slept better than she had in months. She had expected to lie awake turning things over, second-guessing, running through the list of everything that could go wrong. Instead, she fell asleep at 9:30 and woke at 4 without an alarm, her body apparently in full agreement with what her mind had decided. She dressed in the dark, wool trousers and a thermal undershirt and the heavy flannel shirt Walter had bought her 12 years ago from a workwear catalog, the one she wore when she was doing anything serious outside. She laced her boots at the kitchen table with the lamp on low. She ate a bowl of oatmeal standing at the counter because sitting felt too much like stalling. She had packed over the previous 4 days, carefully and in stages, so that nothing looked obviously depleted if one of the children stopped by. 2 large canvas bags and Walter's old external frame backpack, which she had found in the back of the hall closet and adjusted to fit her frame as well as it was going to. The bags held food, enough for 2 weeks if she was careful. Dry goods mostly, oats and rice and lentils and dried beans, hard cheese wrapped in waxcloth, crackers, dried fruit, 2 jars of her own tomato preserves, coffee, a small bag of sugar. She had 2 wool blankets, a waterproof tarp she had found folded in the outbuilding, a first aid kit she had assembled herself from supplies she ordered online over 2 weeks in small batches, her medications in a labeled weekly organizer with a 3-month supply she had accumulated by filling her prescriptions slightly ahead of schedule, a water filter she had researched and ordered after reading 3 separate reviews, a headlamp with extra batteries, and a small propane camp stove for canisters of fuel. She was not going on a camping trip. She was not going on any kind of trip. She was moving. The second canvas bag held tools from Walter's workshop, a selection she had made deliberately and with care over several evenings, carrying things from the outbuilding to the house in small batches, so the shop still looked undisturbed to a casual glance. A good handsaw, 2 chisels and a mallet, a draw knife, a folding rule and a carpenter's pencil, a hatchet, a coil of rope, a box of mixed nails and screws, a hand drill with a set of bits, a small spirit level, a wood plane. She had tested her grip on each tool before packing it, making sure her hands could manage them, acknowledging honestly the ones that would be harder now than they would have been 20 years ago, planning around the limitations rather than pretending they weren't there. The third thing she packed, in the top of the backpack where she could reach it easily, was Walter's journal. He had kept one for the last decade of his life, a plain brown hardcover notebook he wrote in most evenings at the kitchen table after supper. She had not read it after he died. It had felt too private, too much like walking into a room that wasn't hers. But she had taken it from his nightstand drawer 2 weeks ago and put it in the backpack, and she planned to read it in the clearing, in the place where most of it had probably been written about. She turned off the lamp, stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, and looked around at the house she had lived in for 41 years. The walnut table, the wood stove with its low orange glow, the window above the sink where she had stood 10,000 mornings watching the light change over the backfield. She did not say goodbye to it. Saying goodbye implied she was not coming back, and she had not decided that yet. She was not running away from the house. She was running toward something else, which was an entirely different thing. She picked up the bags, settled the backpack onto her shoulders, and went out the back door. The yard was dark and cold, the grass stiff with frost, her breath visible in the beam of her headlamp. She crossed the yard in the dark, moving slowly but steadily, the bags heavy enough to require concentration, the backpack pulling at her shoulders in a way that would definitely be unpleasant by the time she reached the tree line. She reached the tree line. She stood at the edge of the forest with one hand on the bark of the first big maple, exactly as she had stood a dozen times in 2 years, and turned back. The forest was dark beyond the reach of her headlamp, the trail invisible until the light found it, the trees close and dense and smelling of cold earth and last year's leaves, and something underneath that she had no name for but recognized instantly. She had not been in here since the week before Walter's funeral. 2 years, 3 months, and some number of days. She went in. The trail was overgrown, but not gone. Walter had cut it well enough and deep enough that the path held its shape even after 2 years of no maintenance. The trees on either side still marking the corridor, the leaf litter on the ground still thinner along the line of it than in the forest on either side. Miriam moved carefully, watching her footing, the headlamp picking out roots and stones. She went slowly. She was 85 years old with a heavy pack and bags in both hands, and no one coming to help her if she twisted an ankle, and she moved with the deliberate attention of someone who understood the stakes of a single careless step. It took her 40 minutes to reach the clearing. In the old days, walking with Walter at a comfortable pace, it had taken 15. She didn't mind. When the trees opened up and the clearing appeared in the beam of her headlamp, Miriam stopped walking and stood very still for a long moment, her breath coming harder than she'd have liked, her shoulders aching, her feet already feeling the cold through her boot soles. The clearing was exactly as she remembered it, the grass long and silver gray in the artificial light, the sky above it open and enormous and full of stars she hadn't seen properly from the house in years because of the porch light. And there, at the far edge of the clearing, was something that had not been there 2 years ago. Something Walter had built. Something she had not known to look for until this moment. She walked toward it slowly, her headlamp finding it piece by piece as she crossed the clearing. 4 walls. A roof. Small, no bigger than a garden shed, but built with the unmistakable care of a man who had spent his life making things that lasted. Timber framed, the joints clean, the roof covered in overlapping cedar shingles that had weathered 2 winters and were still sound. A single door facing east toward the sunrise. 1 small window on the south wall. Miriam set down her bags. She stood in front of the door for a long time, one hand pressed flat against the wood of it, feeling the grain under her palm. Walter had built her a room of her own, in the clearing, in the forest he had asked her not to abandon. She pushed the door open and went inside. The inside of the structure was small and dark and smelled of cedar and dry wood and something faintly mineral that she eventually identified as the stone Walter had used to build a low platform along the back wall. Flat slabs of local sandstone fitted together without mortar in the way he had learned from an old mason in Randolph County 30 years ago. The platform was wide enough to sleep on. He had thought of that. He had built her somewhere to sleep. Miriam stood in the doorway with her headlamp cutting a yellow cone through the dark interior and took inventory the way she always took inventory of a new situation, methodically, without rushing to conclusions. The floor was packed earth, dry and firm. The walls were timber frame filled with stacked cordwood, a technique Walter had used on a guest cabin he had built for a client in Tucker County years ago. Good insulation, simple construction, honest work. The roof inside was bare rafter, sound and tight, no light coming through anywhere. In the corner to the left of the door was a small iron wood stove, old but solid, with a short length of stovepipe running up through a metal collar in the roof. He had even fitted a damper. On the stone platform at the back, folded with the precision of someone who knew they might not be there to explain things in person, were 2 wool blankets still wrapped in a cotton dust cover to keep them clean. She sat down on the stone platform with her headlamp aimed at the ceiling and let herself cry for about 4 minutes. Then she stopped, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and went back outside to get her bags. That first day, she did very little beyond the absolute minimum required to make the structure habitable for the night. She gathered dry wood from the stack she found under a tarp on the north side of the building, Walter's forward thinking again. Enough seasoned wood to last several weeks. She got the stove lit on the 3rd attempt, the flue drawing well once it warmed, the small space heating faster than she expected. She unpacked her food and arranged it on a shallow shelf she found nailed to the wall beside the door. She unrolled her blankets on top of Walter's, spread her tarp across the gap under the door where cold air moved, ate crackers and hard cheese and dried apricots for supper, and was asleep by 8 o'clock. She woke to birdsong and gray light coming through the east-facing door and lay still for several minutes listening. A wood thrush somewhere close. 2 crows moving through the upper canopy, their calls dropping down through the trees in pieces. The stove had gone cold in the night, but the blankets had held the warmth well enough, and she was stiff but not dangerously cold. She made coffee on the camp stove, standing in the doorway of the structure looking out at the clearing in the early morning light, and felt something she had not felt in 2 years with any consistency. Present. Fully present. In this specific place, at this specific hour, with no performance required of her, and no one watching to assess whether she was managing adequately. The first week was physical work, and it asked more of her than she had honestly anticipated. She was 85 years old and had not done sustained outdoor labor in several years, and her body registered its objections clearly and specifically. Her shoulders ached from the tools. Her knees complained on the uneven ground. Her hands, still competent but slower than they once were, required more deliberate attention on every cut and every joint. She rested when she needed to rest, which was more often than she would have liked, and she worked when she could, which added up to more than her children would have believed possible. She started with a proper door threshold, the existing one uneven enough to be a tripping hazard. Cutting and fitting a length of oak from a fallen tree, she found 40 yards into the woods, splitting it rough with the hatchet and planing it smooth, fitting in a place with 2 wooden pegs she cut and drove by hand. It took her most of a day. In her 50s, it would have taken 2 hours. She did not allow herself to be discouraged by the comparison, because the comparison was meaningless. She was not her 50-year-old self. She was her 85-year-old self, and the threshold fit cleanly and did not rock when she stepped on it, and that was what mattered. The second project was a proper bench outside the east-facing door, somewhere to sit in the morning with her coffee and watch the clearing come alive with the sunrise. Walter's log at the edge of the clearing was still there, weathered but solid, and she had been sitting on it each morning, but her back needed support that a log could not give, and she wanted something she had made herself in this place with her own hands. She built the bench over 3 days from timber she found in the forest, fallen wood dry enough to work, cutting and fitting and joining with a simplicity that Walter had always said was the mark of someone who actually understood construction. Decoration was what you added when you didn't trust the work itself. Miriam trusted the work. She read Walter's journal in the evenings by lamplight, and what she found in it she had not expected. He had been coming to the clearing almost every day in that last summer. She had not known how often, and he had written about it with a detail and feeling that she had never heard him use out loud. He wrote about the birds, about the quality of light in different weathers, about what it felt like to be building something with the knowledge that he was running out of time to build things. He wrote about Miriam constantly, not sentimentally, but specifically, the particular way she held a tool, the sound of her in the kitchen in the early morning, the expression on her face where she was thinking hard about something and didn't know anyone was watching. He had known she would come back. He had built the structure and stacked the wood and folded the blankets and written the journal knowing that someday she would need all of it. And he had prepared for that day the way he prepared for everything, with patience and care and the absolute confidence that the person he loved was capable of far more than most people gave her credit for. On the 8th day, she heard a car on the dirt road that ran along the south edge of the property. She did not panic when she heard the car. She set down her tools, wiped her hands on her trousers, and walked to the south edge of the clearing where a gap in the trees gave a partial view of the road below. Bruce's gray sedan was parked at the property gate. All 3 of them were climbing out. 9 days. She had gotten 9 days, which was exactly what she had calculated, and not a day more. She watched them for a moment through the trees. Bruce was on his phone, probably trying her number again. Diane was looking at the house, which Miriam had left locked and dark. Kevin stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the back field, and then slowly, almost inevitably, looking toward the tree line. He was the one who found the trail. Of course he was. Kevin had spent the most time in this forest as a child, had known the trails better than his siblings, and even after 30 years away, some part of him still remembered where the path began. Miriam watched him push through the long grass at the edge of the yard and find the entrance to the trail and call back to Bruce and Diane, and then all 3 of them were coming in. She went back to the clearing and sat on the bench she had built and waited. They came through the trees 18 minutes later, moving slowly because the trail was overgrown and they were not dressed for it. Bruce in leather shoes that were already muddy, Diane with a branch snagging her coat. Kevin was first into the clearing, and he stopped when he saw the structure, and then he saw Miriam sitting on her bench, and his face went through several things at once that she could not quite name from across the clearing. Bruce and Diane came through behind him and stopped too. Nobody said anything for a moment. Alone? In the forest? Mom, it's been below freezing at night. I have a stove. I have blankets. I've been warm enough. Bruce walked forward, past Kevin, crossing the clearing with his muddy shoes, and stopped in front of her. Up close, she could see that he had not been sleeping well. His face had the drawn, slightly hollowed look of sustained worry rather than ordinary tiredness. She felt a pull of genuine regret about that, and did not let it move her from the bench. "You can't stay out here," he said. "You're 85 years old. This is a shed in the woods, Mom. This is not a place for a person to live." Walter built it, Miriam said. That stopped him. He looked at the structure again, with different eyes. Dad built this. Last summer before he died. He came out here almost every day. I didn't know until I read his journal. She paused. He built it for me. He knew I'd need someone to come back to. He knew before I did. The silence that followed was a different quality from the one before. Kevin had come to stand beside Bruce, and Diane had walked to the structure and put her hand on the door frame the way Miriam had put her hand on it 9 days ago, feeling the wood, understanding something about it without being told. We had no idea he came out here, Kevin said quietly. He kept it private. It was his. Bruce sat down on the ground in front of the bench, not gracefully, just folded down onto the cold grass, and looked up at her. It was such an unexpected thing for him to do that it disarmed her slightly. We signed those papers because we were scared, he said. I want you to know that. We weren't trying to take anything from you. We were scared of losing you the way we lost Dad, suddenly, with no warning, and we try to control the situation because that's what I do when I'm frightened. I control situations. It's what I've always done. I know that, Miriam said. We should have asked you, Diane said from the doorway. We should have sat down with you and asked what you actually wanted and then listened to the answer. We didn't do that. We made a decision and told you about it afterward and called it love. She shook her head. That wasn't love. That was fear wearing love's clothes. Miriam looked at her daughter for a long moment. Diane had never been the one in the family to say the most accurate thing. That had always been Walter's role, and Kevin's occasionally. But she had said the accurate thing just now, plainly and without softening it, and Miriam appreciated it more than she could easily express. The deposit, Miriam said. Cancel it. Bruce nodded. Already done. I called Pinehaven yesterday. She had not expected that. She looked at him carefully. When did you decide that? About 4 days in, he said. When it became clear you had left deliberately and not because something had gone wrong. I started thinking about what Dad would say about what we'd done. He paused. I didn't like what I came up with. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kevin crouched down beside Bruce and looked up at Miriam with an expression she recognized from when he was 9 years old and had broken something and was trying to figure out how to make it right. What do you actually want, Mom? Not what we want. What do you want? Miriam looked around the clearing. The bench she had built. The structure Walter had made for her with hands that had known they were running out of time. The open sky above. The trails that were already beginning to look more like trails again after 9 days of her walking them morning and evening. I want to stay here, she said. I want to finish what your father started and what I've begun. I want to live in this forest on this land that belongs to me on my own terms for as long as I am able. And I want you three to stop making decisions about my life without asking me first. None of them argued. That was the thing she had not quite allowed herself to expect. After all the planning and the fear and the 9 days alone in the cold, when she finally said the true thing out loud to all three of them at once, not one of them argued. 3 months after Miriam June Calloway walked into the forest behind her house with 2 canvas bags and a backpack and her dead husband's journal, she was sitting on the bench she had built outside the east-facing door of the structure Walter had made for her, drinking coffee in the early morning light, watching a pair of wood thrushes argue over territory in the maple at the far edge of the clearing. The structure was not a shed anymore. It was not quite a cabin either, not in any conventional sense, but it was something real and specific and entirely hers. She had built a proper sleeping platform to replace Walter's stone one, fitting it with a thin mattress Kevin had carried in on his second visit, strapped to his back like a man paying a debt he took seriously. She had insulated the walls properly with material Bruce had sourced, and Diane had helped her cut and fit on a Saturday in May when all three of them had come up together and worked alongside her without anyone once suggesting she let them do it instead. She had put in a second window on the north wall for cross-ventilation in summer. She had built proper shelving along the west wall for her food and her books and her medications. She had laid a simple plank floor over the packed earth. The boards fitted tight and level, the work slow and deliberate and good. The garden was the thing she was proudest of, She had cleared a section of the clearing's south edge where the light was strongest and broke the ground herself over 4 days in April, working in the early mornings when her energy was best, resting through the midday hours, going back at it in the late afternoon. Kevin had driven up with seeds she had ordered online. She had planted tomatoes, beans, lettuces, kale, herbs along the sunniest edge. By July, the tomatoes were coming in faster than she could eat them, and she had started a second batch of preserves using a small pressure canner she had asked Bruce to carry in on his April visit. Her children came regularly now, not to inspect, not to assess, not to build a case. They came because she had made something worth coming to, and because the relationship between them had shifted into something more honest than it had been in years, maybe ever. Bruce came once a month, usually alone, and they would sit on the bench in the evening and talk in the way they had not talked since he was young, without roles, without the performance of the capable son and the managed mother. Diane came with her husband in June and spent 3 days, and on the last morning she had sat in the clearing before breakfast and cried quietly in a way she did not try to explain and did not need to. Kevin texted still, every morning, but the text had changed. He no longer asked how she was feeling. He asked what the birds were doing, what she was building, what she had cooked. She answered with the same specificity she always had, and the difference was that now the specificity felt like sharing rather than proof. Dr. Samuel Okafor drove out from Elkins once a month to check on her. He was a quiet man in his 50s who had spent 20 years doing rural house calls across 4 counties and had long since stopped being surprised by the places people chose to live and the reasons they chose them. He checked her blood pressure, reviewed her medications, asked direct questions, and listened to her direct answers. And at the end of his second visit told her that whatever she was doing out here, her numbers were better than they had been at her last checkup in town a year ago. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, and Miriam appreciated that more than she would have appreciated any amount of enthusiasm. Miriam understood. Some things did not translate into explanation. They had to be seen or built or walked into in the dark with a headlamp and 2 heavy bags and the specific kind of fear that sits right alongside the specific kind of certainty that you're doing exactly the right thing. Walter's journal lived on the shelf beside her bed. She had read it 3 times through now. In the final entry, written 6 days before his stroke, he had written 1 paragraph that she had memorized without trying to, the words simply settling into her the way true things settle, without effort. He had written, "The clearing is ready. The wood is stacked. The blankets are folded. All it needs is Miriam. She'll come back when she's ready, and when she does, she'll know exactly what to do with it. She always has. That's the thing about her that nobody sees until they've run out of reasons not to look. She is more capable than anyone has ever given her credit for, and she always was, and she always will be, and I'm grateful every single day that I was the one who got to stand next to her while she proved it." Miriam set her coffee cup down on the arm of the bench and looked out at the clearing in the morning light. The thrushes had settled their argument. The dew was burning off the long grass in thin wisps. Somewhere in the trees above the north trail, a woodpecker was working at something with focused, rhythmic purpose. She was 85 years old. She had built something real in a forest that her children had told her she was too frail to walk through. She had rebuilt relationships that had calcified into something neither side was happy with. She had gone back to the place she had been avoiding for 2 years and found that it had been waiting for her, that Walter had made sure it was waiting, that grief did not have to mean abandonment of the places and the life that gave the grief its weight in the first place. She picked up her coffee again and finished it, and then she went inside and got her tools because there was still more to build, and the morning was good, and she was not done yet. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.